All right, so we have a big panel for this one. This panel is about security, which I think of as a close cousin of privacy, especially in the context of crypto policy, and which is what this panel is about. Where crypto meets national security is the title. I think nearly everyone in this room understands how cryptocurrency networks raise serious national security considerations, and where the disagreements arise is in how exactly to address those considerations. But there should be something else that everyone agrees with. And it's something I remember Mike Mosier saying on stage in October at the DC Privacy Summit, which is these networks are different. Securing them requires new systems and approaches, both legal and technical. Many of you in the room have probably spent a lot of time considering these things yourself, and maybe in a different timeline you would be on stage with us. But today we have these three extremely thoughtful folks on this topic, and they've come prepared to wrestle with it. So first, I'm actually gonna let them introduce themselves. They'll do a better job than me. And the question for all three of you is, can you tell us who you are, where you work, how you got there, and what you focus on now? Start with Isaac.
Sure. I'm Isaac Patka. I'm here representing the Security Alliance. I also run a security firm called Shield 3. The Security Alliance is a nonprofit that operates the SEAL 911 emergency hotline. We're typically the first folks that are pulled into any incident. Whenever there's a big hack, we're usually in the war room, helping the protocol, helping the victims, helping trace funds, track down where they are, and then passing off to a lot of qualified tracing firms that are also part of SEAL's network. A lot of data that flows that we learn from SEAL 911 flows into these like intel sharing agreements and things that we do with like wallets and exchanges and banks. From what we learn doing all of these incidents, we publish a lot of open source best practices frameworks on how not to have the last hack happen to you, how to set up your system on a more operational level. We also provide like free legal services for white hat hackers. So overall, try to be good actors in the cybersecurity space and have representatives from most of the major firms, protocols, wallets, exchanges, and stuff, and VCs in our network. Thanks.
Jessi.
Speaking of VCs, I'm at Ribbit Capital, which is a venture capital firm that invests all over the world. Crypto is one of our main sectors that we invest in. I see some of our companies out there. Thanks for doing the good work. I do legal policy, regulatory compliance, all encompassed in there as well. Been there for about 5 years. I spent about a decade at the DOJ beforehand, which led me into crypto. I was doing national security work. Actually, before the DOJ or FBI really cared about crypto because the amounts were pretty small. But we were seeing DPRK act in much less sophisticated, but still sophisticated ways at the time. 7, 8 years ago at this point. So a lot of these patterns are just repeating, and hopefully the government is learning alongside the bad actors. And how did I get here? Who knows? We're all have our own way into crypto, so I'm excited to be on stage. Thanks for having us.
Kyle.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Kyle Bligen. I'm the head of policy and public affairs at the Decentralization Research Center. We're a nonprofit that works here in the United States. We advocate for decentralization as an emerging feature for all technology, whether it be blockchain, artificial intelligence, and also privacy. Before this, I served in Congress. Worked as a policy advisor on the Financial Services Committee, where we got the first market structure bill and the first stablecoin bill. And before that, I held various roles at the State Department, House Homeland Security Committee, and DOD. And so I like foreign policy and national security first, but have ventured into the financial policy and blockchain world. So excited for this conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to actually start with Kyle. You have your finger on the pulse of the crypto policy discussion in DC. And obviously the conversation has evolved over the years, even though, as Jessi said, we've been hearing kind of the same things, also hearing kind of the same things repeatedly. I'd like you to set the scene for us. Kyle, how would you describe where the conversation is right now from your perspective at this moment with respect to the politics and all of the pending laws and regulations?
That's a good question. One, for those who don't know, I'm pretty sure everybody does, we're in the middle of market structure negotiations. So for the sake of my sanity and for our position, I'm going to say the conversation is positive because we need a bill. The politics are definitely tense, both sides of the aisle are trying to get to a yes on the bill. But as it pertains to the politics of national security, it's interesting. I think when you speak to Dems and Republicans and you ask them, does national security matter? They're going to say yes. Does consumer protection matter? They're going to say yes. How we get there, obviously, is important, and the devil is in the details. I do think we are in a interesting moment in the industry where we probably need to speak with a louder voice and say national security matters, and we need bad actors to, be stopped, and consumer funds need to be protected. Right now, there are multiple provisions in the bill that are trying to parse out what are the AML, BSA requirements, if any, that decentralized technology should be impacted by. At the DRC, we have the responsibility of explaining to policymakers what decentralized infrastructure looks like when there's intermediate points of control and what non-custodial developers do. And how the tech actually works. And we don't want to apply old regulation to new technology. But in that conversation, there's an interesting tension because individuals see that these nation state actors are taking advantage of protocols, hacking them and stealing consumer funds. And so in order to preserve the benefits of decentralized technology and protect developers, we need to make sure that those who are actively hacking and going after consumer funds are stopped to protect the tech. And I think a lot of senators recognize that now, especially given the events of the last week.
Jessi, I was wondering if there's anything, first of all, if there's anything you would add to what Kyle said, and then I also wanted to ask you about, I think you mentioned in your intro that you've been seeing the same patterns, and I think when we talked before this panel, you said you've been hearing the same conversations over and over again for years. So first, is there anything that you would add to what Kyle said, and then also how would you like this conversation to change specifically?
It's hard to follow Kyle. So well spoken. I think that he covered a lot, and I think we'll get to a few of the provisions that we're working on together as well. But to me, the issue that is just needs to change immediately in my mind is that we need to become a lot more victim-centric and think about what are we all building this for? We want to build a better, safer financial system that gives access to everybody around the world, and definitely, we're here based in the United States in Washington, D.C., definitely people down the street that don't have access to a bank account like many of us maybe had when we were growing up. And a lot of times when we use terms like illicit finance or DPRK or even compliance with what? I use the word compliance a lot too. We forget that there are humans behind this, and illicit finance is actually the funding for really, really bad things. And all of us that have worked in either the terrorism space or even engaged with DPRK on other issues have a real understanding of that. But what I'm increasingly seeing is that a hack happens and industry tends to get very defensive. And the truth is that industry has the right to be defensive. For many years, it had to be going into these rooms explaining why it was better, why it was safer, why it wasn't full of criminals. In fact, it's part of the reason why I left the government was because I didn't feel like that message was perpetuating throughout government. But now we don't need to be on the defensive anymore. Now we need to take an offensive step and say, hey, we are building for these consumers. And not only is privacy important to them, but also having their funds protected is important to them. And we need to take a little bit more ownership of that and rather going immediately to who's to blame, is this DeFi, how do we make sure that the regulators don't come after us as they used to. Instead, we need to say, okay, we're gonna build something better here. And Peter and I guess he stepped out, but he and I don't always agree. But one thing he mentioned that I've been thinking about a lot is this programmable compliance tools, because when you go into a room and you say, not only is this better and give more financial access to people, but also we can reach the same goals and have the same incentives as you, but do it in a tech forward way that doesn't impose the old rules onto new tech.
Thank you. And Isaac, feel free to add to anything that's been said, but also I just wanted to point out that you and your colleagues deal every day with the security risks and incidents that arise in these networks. And they can be kind of tough to for normies to wrap their heads around, including normie policymakers. So what do you think that policymakers tend to miss or perhaps don't completely understand about the nature of the problem?
Sure. To the previous points about kind of victims and victimization, and I think that like when you're actually in a room speaking with somebody that just had, their life savings or their company savings or their investment fund and like funds that they're responsible for just stolen due to some like crazy new attack vector that nobody thought was possible, but somebody made a mistake and then in an instant the funds are gone. There's a lot that you learn in trying to manage an incident like that. And I'm, thankfully for my sanity within SEAL, I'm not one of the responders that wakes up at 2 a.m. I'm more on the back end, but I've had the opportunity to be in some of these rooms when these incidents are happening. And something that I find very unfortunate that needs to be fixed is that one of the first things that is asked like after this is like, okay, well, how do I get help from law enforcement? It's like, okay, well, are any of you in the US? Do you have any like victims that are in the US? Cool. Which county in the US? Okay, try to call your local FBI office and hope that the FBI agent that you're getting in touch with has heard of this. And like, if you happen to be in a good county, you have a better chance of getting resolution. If you're in a county in a state that's a bit more unfortunate, or if maybe you're like somebody's based in the US, but most of the victims are not, like, these are the complicated things that people are trying to wrap their heads around. And then once you actually find somebody who's a victim, and meanwhile, the funds have just been stolen. They've been stolen half an hour ago. They're still sitting there. They haven't moved yet. And you're trying to figure out how fast can we actually get this information to the party, to the relevant party, to try to get some sort of court order to get somebody to freeze this money. And you're just racing against the clock and hoping that the right people are talking to each other. One thing that I think that people don't understand is that the people that are responding to these incidents, it's like a network of people that trust each other. There's probably like, maybe tens or hundreds of people around the world that are the ones that are actually responding to all these incidents. And they've built up this trust over the course of years, but some of them are public, some of them are pseudonymous, some of them are completely anonymous. And they all kind of work together in these circumstances to try to help the victims and get information where it needs to go. But they run into roadblocks like every step of the way. And there's a lot that I think that can be done to like reduce those barriers or make it so that we can actually tactically help victims in ways that we currently can't.
Excellent. So now that we've set the stage, let's dig into how some of these factors and variables are affecting actual policy making. Jessi, you are working on some efforts at Ribbit to help make real policy that addresses some of these issues. And one of those is a proposal called the Cryptocurrency Cyber Innovation Center. Can you explain what that is?
Sure, it definitely takes a village, and I know that everybody is putting out ideas out there to solve this problem. But one idea that Ribbit has put out, which you mentioned, is pretty simple in that it's just plumbing, but it's actually pretty complicated to execute. So for anyone who's either been in government, is currently in government, or worked a lot with them, you know how difficult it is for agencies to collaborate, to talk to each other, and to ensure that the seizure rights of the DOJ work well with Treasury, work well with the National Security Council. And the plan is to create an interagency center where all these different agencies can come together and collaborate and use each other's tools in order to stop bad activity on chain. It's initially focused on DPRK, but it's going to be, hopefully broader from there. And there is a component of public-private collaboration as well as emergency freezing as needed. There's a lot of components to it, but it really just comes down to the fact that we need to have better forms of communication, both within government and public-private communication as well. And, SEAL, Crypto ISAC, there's, efforts via the FBI. There's many other efforts out there to make this work, but trying to bring it all together and write it into the legislation that's happening right now is something that's really, really important because, as Kyle said, both sides of the aisle really want to prioritize this. And obviously they have different incentives and they have different parties speaking to them. But one thing that I think everyone can largely agree on is that DPRK and bad actors, that especially ones that are state actors abroad, are individuals that we don't want to have continued access to our funds. I mean, billions have gone to DPRK in the past few years. And so if there's a way that we can use the existing authorities that we have and leverage them in a lot better way so you don't have to rely so much on the local law enforcement that doesn't have access to a blockchain analytics tool, has never really heard of anything besides Bitcoin, the better off we're all going to be.
Actually, the original inspiration for this panel was that Kyle shared a description of the CCIC with me several months ago. and explained that he was working with Ribbit to advance the idea. Kyle, can you fill us in on that process? Kind of sound like you maybe kind of picked the ball up and ran with it.
Yeah, so Ribbit, I love their team. They're full of national security professionals, and a lot of us kind of speak the same language, so I respect all the great work you guys are doing. We viewed this comprehensive whole of government approach as a necessity. On Capitol Hill, senators keep hearing about these massive hacks, right? Iran, China, North Korea, breaking into stealing customer funds. They hear all of these things, but they don't understand how the tech works, and they get very scared. So their default is then to apply old regulations to new tech. We want to prioritize the development of new decentralized technologies. We believe it's immutable, it's great for privacy, consumers benefit. But the threat to true innovation for decentralization in thriving in the US is a regulatory one, because these bad actors are taking advantage, and to be honest with you, these nation state actors are eating the industry's lunch. And so we were like, okay, what are ways in which we can partner with trusted policy partners in DC to support these proposals that actually go after these illicit actors at the source? And the CCIC is one of those. And I think, I just want to underscore this point. You know, if you're a project in the room, or you have the opportunity to watch this later, you have to care about security, if not more than you care about business development. It's very unfortunate to see that so many projects and groups love talking about what some new MOU they signed, some new unlock with some cryptocurrency partner unlocking some new rail, but then they're getting hacked. And real people are losing their funds, and China does not care, and North Korea does not care. If you're already a sanctioned state, you're not giving that money back. And I think for a lot of politicians in the US, their concern is, okay, well, if there is a US-based protocol and they're hacked, I, as a politician, did I have the ability to impact that or limit the possibility of that through legislation? Our response to that politician should not be, yeah, just use traditional BSA AML, because we know it's not fit for purpose for the tech, and that would destroy innovation. And so the CCIC is a great way to go after nation-state actors at the source rather than overburden protocol developers.
Isaac, I'm not sure if you work directly with the DRC on this proposal, but I know that SEAL helped advise. I'm curious what your perspective is based on the way that Jessi and Kyle described it. And can you see how this might, can you maybe provide an example or two of what they're talking about might solve some of the issues that you encounter?
Sure. I think that the information sharing and the cross-agency and coordination and public-private partnerships is like probably the most impactful component here, because there is so often like we have the information, or the information sits in a trusted party and it just can't get to the right place fast enough for it to really have an impact. That happened in many of like the basically every incident that has happened recently. There was an opportunity to halt things. We had time, and first, it's kind of bizarre sometimes. Like you can watch like an incident unfold, and money is sitting in a like freezable stablecoin for 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. The developers may be asleep. Maybe they've gotten lazy because they know that we can't get our act together and like actually do it fast enough. So they don't even bother switching to like a stablecoin that isn't freezable. And so yeah, that happens basically in every attack. One other thing that I'd want to mention also is that some of the larger hacks that we're seeing, like the 200 million, 1.5 billion, a lot of these things just are, in my opinion, like a result of pretty negligent architectural design. Like it's actually quite easy if you like sat down and thought about like what are the things that can go wrong and how fast can they go wrong, and what guardrails can I put in place to make it so they can't go wrong so fast. That's not a hard problem. So like another thing that I'd be really interested in and hope that regulators can push forward is helping. Maybe it's regulators, maybe it's the industry itself. Hopefully we can self-regulate to do this. But like actually think about putting in place better operational standards and architectural standards so that things can't fall apart as fast as they do. One of the reasons why these big hacks happen so fast is because developers like grow really fast and don't think, okay, maybe I should slow down this one part of my protocol, slow down this administrative action. And since they don't put those things in place, then that is what happens when you click on one fake Zoom link and suddenly all of the money for all of your clients is gone in an incident. That just shouldn't be happening, and it doesn't have to happen.
I'm gonna stick with Isaac. What is something you'd like to leave the folks in this room, I mean, you've already made a lot of great points, but if you think about people who really want to hear something kind of policy oriented as a takeaway from this conversation, what would you want to leave folks with?
I mean, I'll just briefly reinforce information sharing, cross-agency coordination, public-private coordination, making it so that the folks that have the data and can get that data to the right folks at the right time so that action can be taken quickly. That would cut out so much of the low-hanging fruit just by being able to do more of that coordination. So that would be my number one ask.
A similar question for Jessi. What would you leave folks in this room with as the crypto policy discussion moves forward? What do you want people to walk away from this conversation with?
Sure. Industry and regulators have a lot of overlapping incentives and goals, and just remembering that when you enter every conversation, I think is really useful. And sometimes I think everyone should have to work in both, because I truly didn't understand either until I worked in the other. But as industry, it's our responsibility to really understand where regulators come from. Like, to them, they wake up every day worried about a hack, worried about something bad happening on their watch that they either could have prevented or could have put in some sort of like stop on. And so instead of looking at it as like we're in combat, instead think about it as we can build stuff together. Because a lot of times people talk about privacy and national security as like they don't work together, but actually they can be really, really collaborative when we think about it, particularly with nation state actors that get a lot of their ability to hack to intrude on our systems by lack of privacy. So finding a way to like overlap that conversation, I think, would be increasingly useful.
Cool. I'm going to end with Kyle, but before I go to Kyle, I just want to say we're going to have 5 minutes or so for questions. And if folks would actually come to this microphone to ask questions, that would be better, because it would be better for the audio, I believe. That's why we put it there. But anyway, I want to go back to Kyle. What would you like to leave folks with as they walk back out into DC and go into more rooms and have more crypto policy discussions?
Yeah, I would say DeFi will not be retail ready if security is not prioritized. You're trying to convince millions of Americans that are engaging in traditional financial rails that the technology is supposed to be the difference maker, that transaction speed will increase, that their day-to-day lives will benefit for seamless transactions, and that we're going to have more equitable finance. Well, if you're a TradFi and you're looking at our industry getting hacked, you don't even have to make the case to say over-regulate them. You can just continue to let them get hacked. And if our response is not serious about taking care of the consumers that we want to onboard, we will let the worst in our industry market these attacks, these vulnerabilities, and it'll detract from the real success that we're trying to have, not only in Congress, but once we need to get to actual regulators and convince the SEC, the CFTC, Treasury, et cetera, that not only is the industry credible, but that we can take these threat actors and these threat vectors seriously.
Cool. Do we have any questions from the crowd? Carol?
So I'll start by saying that I appreciate the intellectual purity of Peter's positions on how developers should be free to develop. But I think, Jessi, you raised a very good point there at the end about making sure that people better understand the national security issues. And sometimes when I'm listening, is Peter still here, or has he left? I wish I would hear from Peter a little bit about embedding something in the conscience of those who are developing, which would, I think, tie into your views. I guess I'm just curious as to to what extent should the developer community step up and be held to our at least in the US, we do have a knowledge standard in our criminal statutes. Should we have more of a knowledge standard that if you're creating the software, make it clearer for the purposes, and you're not being careful about what the implications might be, that you should be held to a different kind of a standard?
Yeah, speaking as a developer, as far as being held for accountable and stuff, I think that's a separate topic, but as far as the responsibility and the conscience of the developer, I do think that we should have a high expectation of them. Someone had told me an analogy once about the current state of how crypto wallets work, where people don't isolate their assets. Everything is all thrown into one thing in their pocket. Imagine if you went to the coffee shop and pulled out your debit card and bought a coffee, and because of some glitch, on the payment pad, you accidentally paid with a deed to your house and your 401k. And like, that's just gone forever. Because that's how most crypto wallets work right now. Because these guardrails aren't in place, because the developers aren't necessarily thinking about or empathizing with their users, I think that we should have that, instill those responsibilities in developers. As to like, I don't understand fully the legal implications of, knowledge standards and stuff like that, but I do think at least ethically, yes, developers should be thinking about those types of things so that these mistakes are not so easy to make.
Anything to add?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think accountability can look like an entire spectrum. I think a lot of people are worried about criminal liability. So let's just put that to the side for a second because of all the debates we're having internally about like what counts as a developer, what counts under the First Amendment, et cetera. But there's also civil liability. There's also liability from the customer when they get their assets stolen. So I think building in some sort of structure that maybe has a look of like a products liability framework or something like that to make sure that people can't just build something dangerous and put it out there into the world and maybe profit off of it without holding any of their activity accountable could be something useful here. I think the difficult thing is sort of trying to understand and separate what is OFAC sanction liability, what is criminal liability, what is civil liability, and then when can you be subject to a class action because people lost all their money or DPRK hacked or something like that. There has to be a real understanding of the nuance here, and that obviously has been lost over the past few years, but luckily we're having these conversations, which definitely did not happen a few years ago, and so, recognizing that neither spectrum is like on the end the right answer, but there has to be something in the middle.
Do we have any other questions? Can you come to the mic?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having this forum. This is really helpful. My name is Mark Samuel. I started a small startup company called Black Blockchain Group. We are primarily a financial education entity specializing in crypto and digital currency. And one of the issues that we had or having is that we wanted to open up a bank account. And because we have blockchain in the name, we can't even, it's difficult to open up a bank account. And to Kyle's point, when, I'm not gonna say the names, but there were large bank institutions say, we don't do crypto. I'm like, whoa. In my former life, I was a team lead at Bureau of Economic Analysis and Commerce Department. I know firsthand, after the repeal of the Steagall Act, that created the systemic risk. We have systemic risk now, and I'm not gonna speak on it, but can you speak to what can large traditional financial institutions do now to mitigate that and also educate themselves? Because we can do it, but I'm alarmed when these large institutions say, we don't even do crypto. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that is what's the phrase we're using now? Debanking, right? How many stories and narratives that we're hearing every single day about individuals that lost access to their accounts. I do think under this new regulatory paradigm we have in this new administration, we do have an opportunity to right-size the atmosphere that engaging in cryptocurrency finance is legal, and that individuals should not view digital assets as a portion of outsized reputational risk. And if we're going to be serious about democratizing finance, traditional incumbents certainly cannot view debanking and use that as a competitive guardrail. And that's another thing we have to watch out for. It's one thing if you say digital assets don't need to be regulated, we don't really know if we can custody them under what environments, et cetera, and then produce whatever legal arguments you need. But if you're using it to gate out people from getting access to bank accounts as a way of artificially suppressing competition because traditional products can't compete, that's something that needs to be looked at. And hopefully, under this administration and all the ones we have in the future, if the U.S. wants to truly become the quote-unquote crypto capital of the world, we can't have that debanking continue.
We're pretty short on time. Can you keep it? Can you do your question fairly quickly?
I'll try. My name is Max Meislich. I'm a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We're a national security-focused think tank. And I actually worked at Treasury working on sanctions before coming to FTD during the tornado cash period. And I'm just curious, specifically related to DeFi, right? How should we actually approach the challenges of systems like, or applications like Tornado Cash in relation to threats from North Korea? If we're going to kind of take this hands-off approach to the non-custodial mixer, what is the response for national security policymakers that actually addresses the threat as it is?
Who wants to take that one?
You want to put your prosecutor hat on? I'll talk about Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of personal thoughts from my experience prosecuting these cases. And I think that there's a lot that can be done, like with low-hanging fruit here right now. Like, we're still trying to solve basic, like, hacks of centralized exchanges at this point, let alone like how do we incorporate DeFi. You know, not to shill a paper, but recently I put out a paper about programmable risk management on chain and how it would sort of solve a lot of the regulator issues, the incentives, as well as allow DeFi builders to put whatever sort of protections they want to put on. And so I think it has to be less of a hammer, like you have to do this, because we sort of tried that and it hasn't fully worked yet. And the result of trying harder would just be to put more maybe developers at risk or push innovation outside the United States, but instead to make it a commercially viable decision to say, I'm going to build a really safe protocol, or I'm going to build a really safe app. And because it's safe, we're going to get institutional money and consumers that want to use it. And so instead of making it like, make it more of like a carrot than a stick of the safer your protocol, the more you can say your protocol's safe. And that way you can get the institutional funds and the banks to bank with you. Because in the end, we're also trying to build like the future of finance, I assume. And that requires some institutional money as part of it. And so it has to be a race to the top rather than the bottom.
Thank you, Isaac, Jessi, and Kyle. Great discussion.